The German lieutenant's hands were shaking as he read the field telephone report for the third time. It was just after 0300 hours on the 10th of July, 1943, and nothing about the message made sense. American paratroopers, behind the coastal defences, everywhere. The Italian observation post at Piano Lupo had gone silent 20 minutes ago. Now came reports of men falling from the sky near Gela, near Vittoria, near Nisemi dots on the map that formed no coherent pattern, no logical drop zone, just chaos scattered across 30 miles of Sicilian countryside. The lieutenant had studied airborne doctrine at the War Academy. Paratroopers consolidated. They seized bridges and crossroads. They didn't simply appear like ghosts across an entire invasion front, cutting telephone lines and ambushing supply columns in the darkness. But that's exactly what was happening. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the story persons. Comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Within 5 days, 3 German divisions, the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, and elements of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division would be shattered, withdrawn, or rendered combat ineffective. The question wasn't whether American paratroopers were elite soldiers. The question was simpler and more disturbing. Why had the Germans allowed this to happen? Why had the most important invasion beach in the Mediterranean been left vulnerable to an airborne assault that German intelligence had predicted, that German commanders had wargamed, and that German forces had proven singularly unable to prevent or contain? The answer lay not in a single failure, but in a cascade of miscalculations, beginning with a fundamental misunderstanding of how airborne warfare actually worked when everything went wrong. In the spring of 1943, Sicily represented the obvious next target for Allied invasion. North Africa had fallen. The Italian mainland beckoned. But Sicily came first, a stepping stone, a fortress, and a test. For the Germans, defending it meant shoring up their weakest ally. Italian coastal divisions held most of the beach defences, soldiers whose morale had been eroding since the disaster at El Alamein. German mobile reserves, the Hermann Göring Division, and the 15th Panzer Grenadiers positioned themselves inland, ready to race toward any landing beach and drive the invaders back into the sea. It was sound defensive doctrine. The Italians would slow the assault, the Germans would destroy it. German intelligence correctly identified the threat of airborne operations. Allied paratroopers had seized objectives in North Africa. British glider troops had captured bridges. The pattern was clear. Airborne forces would land ahead of amphibious assaults, seizing key terrain to prevent counterattacks from reaching the beaches. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht issued specific directives. Reinforce the high ground behind likely landing zones. Position mobile reserves to respond rapidly. Maintain robust communications. They simply believed they were ready. What they didn't understand was how American airborne forces would arrive. The 82nd Airborne Division had been training for this moment since its activation in 1942. At Fort Bragg, then at staging areas in North Africa, thousands of young Americans learned to jump from aircraft, assemble in darkness, and fight as light infantry behind enemy lines. The division's commander, Matthew Ridgway, understood that paratroopers represented a new kind of soldier, not just infantry delivered by air, but shock troops whose very presence behind enemy lines created psychological chaos far exceeding their actual numbers. The training emphasized speed, aggression, and initiative. Once on the ground, isolated groups of paratroopers were expected to seize any target of opportunity, disrupt enemy movements, and above all, never surrender the initiative. The plan for Sicily reflected this aggressive doctrine. The 82nd's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel James Gavin, would jump the night before the beach landings, securing high ground and road junctions near Gela to prevent German armour from reaching the beaches. It was the division's first combat operation. Everything depended on precise navigation, on dropping the right troops in the right places at the right time. That precision never materialized. The pilots of the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing were experienced airmen, but most had never flown in combat, never navigated over blacked-out terrain while under fire, never attempted to maintain formation in darkness over the Mediterranean. The flight path brought them over the invasion fleet American ships that opened fire on anything airborne, friendly or otherwise. After sunset, high winds scattered the formations. Anti-aircraft fire disrupted the carefully planned approach routes. When the green light finally flashed and paratroopers began jumping into the Sicilian night, they were scattered across 1,000 square miles of countryside, often miles from their intended drop zones. From the German perspective, this should have been a disaster for the Americans' isolated groups of lightly armed infantry, separated from their heavy weapons and support, dropped into terrain the defenders knew intimately. German doctrine emphasized that scattered paratroopers were vulnerable, that localized counterattacks could eliminate them before they consolidated. The textbooks said airborne operations required concentration of force. The reality over Sicily on the night of July 9th and 10th, 1943, defied those textbooks completely. Because what the Germans discovered was that scattered paratroopers were, in some ways, far more dangerous than concentrated ones. A German supply column heading toward the Gela beaches encountered a roadblock at a crossroads it had travelled through safely just an hour before. The Italian guards were gone. American paratroopers with bazookas occupied the ditch line. The lead truck exploded. The column scattered. The road stayed closed. An Italian artillery battery received a telephone call, ordering it to displace immediately. German forces were retreating. The call was a lie, delivered in German by an American lieutenant who'd found a working field telephone. By the time the Italians realized the deception, they'd abandoned their guns. A German company commander, rushing his troops forward to reinforce the coastal defenses, encountered rifle fire from a farmhouse that shouldn't have held enemy troops. He deployed for an attack. While his men assaulted the farmhouse, defended by perhaps a dozen Americans, the crucial first hours of the invasion slipped away. By the time he'd secured the building, Allied troops were already ashore in strength. The chaos multiplied across the entire invasion front. German commanders received reports of American paratroopers everywhere, accurate reports, but so numerous and scattered that determining which ones represented actual threats proved impossible. The Hermann Göring Division, ordered to counterattack toward the beaches, found its march routes interdicted, its communications cut, its lead elements ambushed from unexpected directions. Small groups of American paratroopers, often numbering no more than a squad or a platoon, occupied positions that forced German columns to deploy, to reconnoiter, to waste precious hours dealing with threats that shouldn't have existed in the German rear area. What the German defenders couldn't realize in the confusion of those first hours, was that the dispersion of American airborne forces had accidentally created something far more disruptive than the planned operation would have achieved. A consolidated airborne force at designated drop zones could be located, fixed, and destroyed. But hundreds of small groups scattered across 30 miles of countryside created a fog of uncertainty that paralyzed German decision-making precisely when speed was essential. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Gorham, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 505th, landed miles from his intended drop zone with only a handful of his men. By dawn, he'd assembled perhaps 40 paratroopers, a force too small to seize his assigned objectives. So he did something the German defenders never anticipated. He attacked anyway. His scratch force ambushed German trucks, cut telephone lines, and seized an Italian ammunition dump, creating the impression of a major American presence in an area the Germans had considered secure. Other officers made similar decisions. Captain Edwin Sayer, separated from most of his company, took his available men and assaulted an Italian coastal battery that was shelling American landing craft. The battery fell silent. Major Mark Alexander, with barely a platoon's worth of troops, established a defensive position on the Biazzo Ridge and held it against repeated German attacks, preventing enemy reconnaissance from identifying weak points in the American beachhead. The Germans had planned for American paratroopers. They'd prepared for consolidated drop zones, for coherent enemy formations seizing predictable objectives. What they encountered instead was something their doctrine had no answer for. Light infantry with enormous initiative, scattered across terrain the defenders thought secure, attacking targets of opportunity and creating tactical problems that multiplied faster than German staff officers could process the reports. By the afternoon of July 10th, less than 18 hours after the first American paratroopers had landed, German situation maps showed enemy airborne forces in locations that seemed impossible. The maps weren't wrong. The reality was simply stranger than German training had prepared them for. American paratroopers were everywhere, because they'd landed everywhere not by design, but because the operation had gone catastrophically off-plan in ways that accidentally maximized disruption. The psychological impact proved devastating. German soldiers trained to fight a mobile armored war suddenly found themselves dealing with infantry ambushes behind what should have been secure lines. Italian allies, already demoralized, began surrendering or simply disappearing as reports of American paratroopers spread. The telephone network, the German military's primary means of communication, became unreliable as line after line was cut. Field commanders couldn't determine which reports represented significant threats and which were local nuisances. The fog of war, normally a tactical inconvenience, became an operational paralysis, and the Americans were just getting started. Counterattack came on the morning of July 11th, 1943, exactly as Allied planners had anticipated. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division, Germany's elite airborne armoured formation, rolled toward the Gela beachhead, with orders to drive the American landing force back into the Mediterranean. On paper, the division possessed overwhelming superiority: Tiger tanks, experienced crews, and mobile artillery that should have shredded the lightly armed infantry clinging to the beaches. The American 1st Infantry Division, still consolidating its positions after the previous day's landing, appeared vulnerable. German commanders expected to reach the water's edge by afternoon. They never got close. The problem began before the first German tank fired a shot. The Hermann Göring Division's approach routes had been chosen carefully, roads that offered good mobility, terrain that allowed the panzers to maneuver. But those same routes had been mapped by Allied intelligence, and American paratroopers had spent the previous night infiltrating the area. When the German columns advanced, they encountered not an open road but a series of unexpected obstacles. A bridge near Ponte di Rillo, intact the previous evening, had been damaged by demolitions. German engineers moved forward to assess repairs. American snipers, paratroopers from the 505th, who'd found good positions in the surrounding hills, began picking off the engineers. The bridge got repaired eventually, but the delay cost an hour. An hour was enough for American forces on the beach to bring more artillery ashore. The pattern repeated at crossroads and choke points across the division's axis of advance. German commanders found themselves making tactical decisions based on threats that shouldn't have existed. Should they deploy to clear a hilltop occupied by perhaps 20 American paratroopers, or should they bypass the position and accept fire into their flanks as they advanced? Either choice cost time, and time, in the opening hours of an amphibious invasion, was the resource that mattered most. When the lead German tanks finally approached the beachhead perimeter, they encountered something that shouldn't have been there: naval gunfire. The USS Boise, a light cruiser with 6-inch guns, had been assigned to provide fire support for the landing. Now its guns engaged German armour at ranges where the panzers couldn't return fire. Spotters, some of them the same scattered paratroopers who'd been disrupting German movements all morning, called in coordinates. Shells weighing over 100 pounds began falling among the German tanks. The Hermann Göring Division had trained to fight enemy armour, enemy infantry, enemy artillery. They had not trained to fight warships. The attack stalled. German tanks withdrew, regrouped, and tried again from a different direction. American artillery, now fully ashore and positioned, added its weight to the naval guns. German infantry, advancing to support the armour, encountered American paratroopers who'd been reinforcing the beachhead positions throughout the morning. These weren't the disorganized, scattered troops the Germans expected. These were soldiers who'd spent 36 hours behind enemy lines, who'd already ambushed supply columns and overrun Italian positions, who'd learned in the hardest way possible that isolated paratroopers survived by taking the initiative and never surrendering momentum. The battle raged throughout July 11th. The Germans committed their reserve, the Americans held. And gradually, as the day wore on, German commanders began to understand that something fundamental had changed. This wasn't like France in 1940, where aggressive armor broke through and created operational chaos. This wasn't even like the Soviet Union, where vast spaces allowed for maneuver and exploitation. This was a different kind of fighting, a grinding, attritional battle where American firepower, American logistics, and American will proved equal to German tactical skill. By evening, the Hermann Göring Division had lost over 50 tanks and suffered over 600 casualties. They'd gained perhaps 2 miles against a beachhead that now stretched for 15 miles along the Sicilian coast. The counterattack had failed. More importantly, it had failed despite German forces possessing every advantage except the one that mattered. The Americans had gotten ashore, had held their positions, and had demonstrated that German doctrine for defeating amphibious invasions simply didn't work when the enemy possessed overwhelming firepower and an airborne force that disrupted the defenders' ability to concentrate. The 15th Panzergrenadier Division, positioned further east near Vizini, faced a different but equally frustrating problem. British forces had landed on the eastern beaches, and the 15th had orders to counterattack and seal off that sector. But the division's commanders discovered that virtually every road junction, every village, every piece of commanding terrain between their assembly areas and the British beachhead had been contested or occupied overnight by American paratroopers who'd landed far from their intended zones. The 82nd Airborne's scattered drop had accidentally put small groups of Americans precisely where they could do maximum damage to German lateral movements. A company of German infantry, ordered to clear the town of Vittoria, entered the outskirts and immediately took fire from multiple directions. The Americans, perhaps 30 paratroopers from different units who'd assembled during the night, had occupied stone buildings and prepared defensive positions. The German company commander called for artillery support. While he waited, more paratroopers filtered into the town from surrounding countryside. By the time German guns began firing, what should have been a simple clearing operation had become a deliberate attack against a reinforced enemy position. The town fell eventually, but the delay consumed most of a day. The 15th Panzergrenadier Division never reached the British beachhead in strength. This was the reality that German after-action reports struggled to articulate. American paratroopers, despite being scattered, despite missing most of their heavy equipment, despite the operation going catastrophically wrong by every measure of airborne doctrine, had achieved something more valuable than seizing their assigned objectives. They'd created pervasive uncertainty across the entire German defensive system. Every report of American paratroopers, and there were hundreds of such reports in those first 72 hours, represented a potential threat that required reconnaissance, assessment, and allocation of forces. German staff officers found themselves managing dozens of small tactical problems simultaneously, each one individually insignificant but collectively paralyzing. The material evidence of American capability began to accumulate in ways German soldiers couldn't ignore. A German squad, overrunning an abandoned American position near Nishimi, found equipment that spoke to an industrial capacity beyond anything they'd encountered. The paratroopers had been eating sea rations pre-packaged meals, each one identical, produced by the millions. They'd been carrying Monet-Garand rifles, semi-automatic weapons that gave individual infantrymen firepower equivalent to an entire German squad's bolt-action Mausers. Their radios, even the SCR-300 backpack sets carried by individual platoons, were more reliable than German battalion-level communications equipment. But the real shock came from the sheer quantity. American paratroopers, who'd been isolated for days, cut off from resupply, still had ammunition. German prisoners reported that the Americans never seemed to ration their fire, never seemed concerned about conservation. They shot at anything that moved, called in artillery on suspicion rather than confirmed targets, expended ordnance, the way a wealthy man spent loose change. This wasn't the grinding war of attrition that Germany had prepared for, where careful husbanding of resources determined long-term survival. This was industrial warfare at a scale that rendered traditional military economy irrelevant. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On July 12th, the third day of the invasion, German commanders attempted to stabilize a front that kept dissolving. The problem wasn't that American forces were pushing forward aggressively. The beachheads were still relatively shallow, and Allied commanders were consolidating rather than exploiting. The problem was that the Germans couldn't establish a coherent defensive line. Every attempt to anchor a position, to establish strong points that would channel American advances into killing zones, foundered because American paratroopers kept appearing behind those positions. Roads that should have been secure supply routes required armed escorts. Villages in the German rear required garrisons. Telephone lines needed constant repair. The operational tempo, the speed at which military organizations process information, make decisions, and execute orders had been reduced to a crawl by the persistent presence of small American units that refused to surrender, withdraw, or behave like defeated forces. German doctrine emphasized the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point where maximum force achieved breakthrough and exploitation. But how did you create a Schwerpunkt when you couldn't mass forces without exposing supply lines to interdiction? How did you concentrate combat power when every concentration attracted overwhelming American artillery fire? The tactical methods that had brought victory in Poland, France, and the opening years in Russia proved inadequate against an enemy that possessed both material superiority and the tactical flexibility to exploit that superiority at every level of combat. The human cost accumulated in ways that German commanders found increasingly difficult to explain to their subordinates. Casualty reports from units engaged with American paratroopers showed patterns that violated expectations. German platoons with numerical superiority, good positions, and veteran leadership found themselves pinned down or forced to withdraw by smaller American forces that possessed better communications, more automatic weapons, and the confidence to call for artillery support that arrived with devastating accuracy. The myth of German tactical invincibility, carefully cultivated since the early Blitzkrieg victories, began to erode among troops who'd actually faced American soldiers in combat. Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Furch, serving with the Hermann Göring Division, recorded his impressions in a diary later captured by Allied forces. His entry for July 13, 1943, was blunt. "We have been told the Americans are inexperienced, that their infantry cannot stand against determined attack. Perhaps this is true elsewhere. The paratroopers we face here are not inexperienced. They do not withdraw when outflanked. They do not conserve ammunition. They fight like men who believe they will be resupplied tomorrow, because they will be. Our casualties mount. We achieve nothing." Furch wasn't describing superhuman Americans. He was describing the reality of industrial warfare. Soldiers equipped with reliable weapons, supported by abundant artillery, backed by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than combat consumed them, and trained to take initiative rather than wait for orders. The scattered airborne drop had accidentally taught American paratroopers the most valuable lesson of modern war: that small units with good communications and fire support could achieve effects far exceeding their numbers, provided they acted aggressively and never allowed the enemy to consolidate. By July 14th, the fifth day of the invasion, the German position in Sicily had become untenable. The Hermann Göring Division, rather than driving Allied forces into the sea, had been driven back with staggering losses. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division had failed to contain the British advance. Italian coastal divisions had effectively ceased to exist as combat formations units had surrendered en masse, melted away, or simply refused orders to counterattack. The initial plan to defeat the invasion at the beaches had failed completely. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the Mediterranean, faced a choice between two catastrophes: commit more divisions to Sicily and risk losing them when the Allies inevitably cut off the island, or accept the loss of Sicily and withdraw what remained of German forces to defend the Italian mainland. He chose withdrawal. Beginning on July 15th, German units began conducting fighting retreats toward Messina, where they would eventually evacuate across the straits to the mainland. The defense of Sicily had failed in less than a week. The American 82nd Airborne, despite the chaos of its insertion, despite the scattered drops and missed objectives, had achieved something remarkable. The division's paratroopers had disrupted German defensive preparations, delayed critical counterattacks during the most vulnerable hours of the amphibious landing, and created a psychological effect far exceeding their actual combat power. German commanders, preparing their after-action analyses, struggled to explain how lightly armed airborne forces had contributed so decisively to their defeat. The textbooks said scattered paratroopers were vulnerable, that airborne operations required precise insertion and rapid consolidation. Reality said something different, that modern paratroopers, properly trained and aggressively led, could create operational chaos even when everything went wrong. The cost to the 3 German divisions was staggering when measured against the operation's brief duration. The Hermann Göring division lost roughly 60% of its tanks and over 2,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in 5 days of fighting. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division suffered comparable losses, with entire battalions reduced to company strength. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, Germany's elite paratroopers, had been committed piecemeal and defeated in detail, never able to concentrate its strength against a single objective. All 3 formations required months of refitting before they could be considered combat effective again. The broader implications extended far beyond Sicily. German military intelligence had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Allied airborne forces represented a genuine operational threat, capable of achieving strategic effects even when tactical execution fell short of perfection. The scattered drops that should have doomed the American paratroopers had instead created conditions that German doctrine couldn't counter. This realization shaped German defensive planning for the remainder of the war. When Allied forces invaded Normandy nearly a year later, German commanders positioned reserves far enough back that they couldn't immediately counterattack the beaches, because they feared airborne landings behind coastal defenses would cut off and destroy units positioned too close to the shore. The irony was almost perfect. The 82nd Airborne Sicily operation had been judged a near disaster by American commanders immediately after the invasion. The scattered drops, the high casualties during insertion, the failure to achieve assigned objectives, all of these seemed to validate critics who argued that airborne operations were too risky, too dependent on factors outside anyone's control. General George Patton, commanding the American 7th Army in Sicily, initially questioned whether the paratroopers had been worth the casualties and confusion they'd caused. But from the German perspective, the operation had been terrifyingly effective. The American paratroopers had created exactly the kind of operational paralysis that German blitzkrieg doctrine had once inflicted on their enemies: uncertainty about enemy locations, disrupted communications, delays in critical decisions, and a gnawing sense that the enemy was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The Germans had allowed the 82nd Airborne to drop behind their lines not through negligence or incompetence, but because Allied control of the air made preventing the drops impossible. And once those paratroopers were on the ground, German forces discovered they had no effective doctrine for eliminating scattered airborne forces that fought with the initiative and aggression of men who knew their survival depended on maintaining offensive momentum. The question the German lieutenant had asked himself at 0300 hours on July 10th, why had this been allowed to happen, had a simpler answer than military theory suggested. It had been allowed to happen because preventing it would have required Germany to possess either the air superiority to shoot down the transport aircraft, or the mobile reserves to rapidly eliminate every scattered group of paratroopers before they could coalesce into a coherent threat. Germany had neither, and without those capabilities, Airborne operations became not a risky gamble, but an asymmetric advantage that leveraged American strengths, industrial capacity, firepower, and aggressive small unit leadership against German weaknesses. The veterans of the 82nd Airborne who survived Sicily went on to jump over Normandy, to fight through Holland during Operation Market Garden, to hold the line at the Battle of the Bulge. Many of them would later reflect that Sicily, chaotic and terrifying as it was, had been the crucible that transformed them from trained paratroopers into combat veterans. They'd learned that dispersion wasn't fatal if you maintained aggression, that small units with initiative could achieve disproportionate effects, and that the enemy, any enemy, regardless of reputation, could be defeated if you refused to surrender the psychological advantage. For the Germans, Sicily represented something darker. The first clear demonstration that industrial warfare had evolved beyond the point where tactical skill and operational artistry could compensate for material inferiority. The small groups of American paratroopers scattered across Sicily in July 1943 weren't exceptional soldiers. They were adequately trained troops equipped with reliable weapons and backed by overwhelming firepower. They'd won not because they were better warriors than their German opponents, but because they represented a nation that could afford to scatter a division of paratroopers across 30 miles of hostile countryside and still achieve strategic objectives through the sheer depth of their resources and the aggressiveness of their doctrine. In the final accounting, the 3 German divisions lost in Sicily, reduced to shadows of their former strength, withdrawn from combat for refitting, rendered unable to oppose the subsequent Allied invasion of Italy, represented not just a tactical defeat, but a validation of a new kind of warfare. The age of maneuver, where brilliant commanders could win battles with inferior forces through superior execution, was ending. The age of industrial attrition, where the nation with more factories and more aggressive soldiers would simply grind down its opponents, had begun. The American paratroopers who dropped into Sicily that chaotic night in July 1943 were harbingers of that future, not through any individual heroism, though many acts of heroism occurred, but through their embodiment of a military system that could absorb massive operational failures and still achieve strategic success. The German lieutenant who'd read those first confused reports at 0300 hours survived the Sicily campaign. He was evacuated through Messina in early August, made it back to Italy, and eventually wrote a letter home that Allied censors intercepted months later. In it, he tried to explain what he'd experienced. We were told we would face inexperienced Americans. Perhaps that was true elsewhere. We faced an enemy who fought as though resources were infinite, as though every bullet expended would be replaced tomorrow, as though defeat was simply impossible because the factories in America would always produce more tanks, more guns, more ammunition than we could destroy. We could not win against such an enemy, not because they were better soldiers, but because they represented something we could not match. A nation fully mobilized for industrial war, fighting not with desperation but with confidence born of absolute material superiority. He'd understood, perhaps more clearly than his commanders, the true lesson of Sicily. The Americans hadn't won because their paratroopers had landed perfectly, or because their tactical execution had been flawless, or because individual American soldiers were superior to their German counterparts. They'd won because the United States could afford to have an airborne operation go completely wrong and still achieve its objectives through the sheer weight of firepower, logistics, and industrial production. Germany, fighting on 4 fronts with dwindling resources and a shrinking industrial base, could afford no such failures. And in a war where one side could absorb catastrophic mistakes while the other could not, the outcome was never really in doubt. The Sicily operation had been a preview of the next 2 years of fighting in Europe, a relentless, grinding advance where Allied material superiority overwhelmed German tactical skill, where American units learned through experience to match and eventually exceed German operational competence, where the outcome of individual battles mattered less than the broader trajectory of industrial production and resource allocation. The 3 German divisions that had entered Sicily, confident in their ability to drive the Allies back into the sea, left the island shattered, their confidence broken not by superior enemy soldiers, but by a military system that could turn even chaos and confusion into operational advantage. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.